This is Greg Wilkinson again with the hope from the hearts of Montana. I normally don't do a preview the day before I have to do the interview, but in this case I have to make an exception. I should have probably titled it The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and I didn't. This is a story about an old man. He's 93 now. His name is Kenny. And about 14 to 15 years ago, I lived in a mobile home park down in Billings. And every day, I would see this old man between 4 and 4:30 come walking down the alley with this black and white dog, never on a leash, which made everybody mad. And he was going to his daughter's house. She would cook him supper just a few doors down on the other side of the alley. And like clockwork, I'd see him. And I had built a shop where I was forging knives out of old files. Older the file, the better the knife. They had high carbon steel. But the old man came down through there one night, and I saw him. He walked with a cane. He couldn't leash the dog. If he'd leashed the dog, it would have yanked him to the ground. Gunner was a good-sized dog. But I saw him wave at a neighbor. And the neighbor was looking straight at him, and he wouldn't wave back. And something tapped on my heart. I call it a tap. And it was either the next day or a couple days later. I'm trying to recall. But I was out in the shop, and I heard the dog bark, other dogs barking. And it was about that time. So I went outside the shop, and sure enough, it was Kenny. Didn't know his name then. And he was walking to his daughter's house, as he always does. And I left the shop, and I went out to the wired, chicken wire, hog wire, whatever you want to call it, fence line. And I said, "Hello, neighbor." And he looked over at me, almost in shock. And I said, "Hey, come on over." So he called his dog Gunner back, and he walked up to the fence, and he introduced himself, said, "Hi, I'm Kenny." And I said, "Oh, I'm Greg." He says, What exactly are you doing out there? I hear banging and like a hammer and hitting steel. What are you building out there?" And I said, "Well, I make knives out of old steel. Wish I could still do that again." And he had a glimmer in his eye. And he looked up at me and he says, I've always wanted to know how to make a knife." And he looked down. And I said, "Hey, Kenny." And he looked me in the eye. I'll never forget the moment. And I said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And he got this twinkle in his eye. He said, "Nothing." I said, "Well, you are now. What do you say you come over tomorrow and we'll make a knife together?" And it was on. You have no idea what hello can mean in your lifetime. And if you want to click off this channel right now, you go right ahead, because I'm going to tell you something that I do know. If the love of God is in your heart, and you know it is. What do you think he meant about life more abundantly? You've got an abundant amount of love in your heart, and you can't keep it there. He gives you more than you need so you can share it with others. Sure enough, next day, here comes Kenny. And he'd never done one before. He was a welder by trade. Don't get me wrong. He worked with steel his entire life. He lived in the Gap for 44 years and spent his entire life up there basically. And he met a woman, and she had some kids, and he married her, and by golly, he adopted those kids. He didn't have to, but he did, and he loved them their whole life. But as he's making the knife, I found out his nickname was Sledgehammer Kenny, because when he would come down to Billings, he worked for a tanker company that would build the gas tanks, the big ones that are on 40-foot trailers that haul fuel, and he was the only guy small enough to crawl down inside through the hatch. They'd lower him down there, and they'd hear all this banging going on, and it was Sledgehammer Kenny. And he was so little. He still is. He's 93 now. But the hello one day led from a hello to a life of love. You have no idea what the simplest thing can do with an elderly person. Everyone in the neighborhood ignored him. Nobody wanted anything to do with this old man walking his dog every single day. Everybody basically ignored him. I later found out that people didn't understand why I spent any time with him. They were like, why do you keep going down there every day? And I'll tell you about that. You know, I think I'd rather eat a bowl of water with a fork before I gave a crap about what people think of me. Every day after Kenny finished that knife, he was supposed to wait until Christmas to give it to his daughter, God bless her, and he didn't wait. Oh, heavens no. He gave it to her immediately, and she carved the Christmas dinner with it. But every single day for all those years, I would go down there, and he met my son. He adopted my son. Not legally. He adopted him as grandpa and grandson. My son would go down there, and unfortunately Gunner died. Kenny's wife had died, like I said, just before I met him. Kenny's wife had died. All he had left was Gunner. Gunner got cancer, and Gunner had to be put down. And those are all hard times. Hard times, but every day I'd go down there for happy hour. Now, happy hour for Kenny was 11:30 a.m. I'd walk down there like clockwork, and if I was late, he wouldn't be angry, he'd just be sad. But, you know, I'd go down there, and he'd be sitting there with a bottle of tomato juice and a cold beer, which sometimes got warmer, waiting for me. And I'd always ask him, why do you want to ruin a perfectly good beer with tomato juice? What's the matter with you? He'd giggle. And I said, you know what? I'll bet you if you owned a submarine, you put a screen door on it. And he'd always laugh and laugh and laugh, and his laugh is just contagious. Such a beautiful-hearted person. But one day my son and I were fishing. We were about 35 minutes away from home, and I got a phone call that he'd had a heart attack. And I don't think I've reeled a fishing pole up faster in my life as that day. And got back to town, unloaded everything, headed to the hospital. I think I still had night crawlers underneath my fingernails from pinching them off on my hook. And I came in and I sat next to him and held his hand. And he began to cry. And of course I did too. Well, he had a friend, her name was Babe. She would come down. She was in her late 80s. He knew her from her husband and wife, would go camping with Kenny's husband and wife. And she'd come down to see him, and I used to pick on her a lot. And he just loved when I picked on her because she never made the bed right. And he was so picky about when you get up in the morning, you got to make your own bed. And she wanted a romantic affair with him, and he didn't want it. And I'd always tease him, "Hey, where's your girlfriend?" But I'd tease Babe, and he would just sit there with his, well, they call it a shit-eating grin, but he would grin and just eat it up. And she loved me to death too. Well, I loved her, and I loved my friend. But he got out of the hospital. He survived the heart attack. And then I thought he was going to have another one, because one day I had to go to him and tell him that I was going to list my home and I was going to move back to the mountains, that I'd found some property. And I was holding his hand when I said that. And he had tears in his eyes. And got to pardon me for a minute here. He looked at me and said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do without you?" All right, hang on. I gotta pause this. So I said I'd come back and see him. My son, of course, was growing up, living his own life, and he'd go to see Kenny as often as he could. But it was just a really hard situation. And you ever get one of those moments where you get a little tap on your shoulder and you don't know why? You can't understand what's going on, yet something will just peck at your mind and your heart. And well, that's what happened the other day. And I was going to try to call Babe, and I didn't. So I thought, since Kenny can't hear me on the phone, because the last time I called he couldn't hear me because he's so old, and I thought about calling his daughter, so I called her, and there was no answer. So I thought I'd try to call Kenny, and he's got newer hearing aids now, and he actually heard me. And he told me that Babe just died 2 days ago. And his daughter ended up calling me, and she said that Kenny's going to outlive her. She's a cancer survivor, but not anymore. She said she's got just a little time to live. She's had to transfer everything to her brother, who only sees Kenny once a week. And I'm supposed to be there tomorrow. Let me try to explain something. If you don't like what I've got to say, that's all right. 1 John 4:11. Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought to also love one another. Or John 13:35. By this shall all men know you that you are my disciple, if you have love one to another. And you have no idea how much blessing, how overflowing blessings that my son and I have received from knowing This old elderly man, so full of wisdom, so full of stories, with such a big heart, from a simple hello. If you're driving around town, you got a bumper sticker that says, I love Jesus, and a cross hanging from your rear view mirror, and you don't say hello to an elderly person or spend time with them, I have a suggestion for you. Take a sharp razor blade, scrape off your bumper sticker, and go sell your cross at a pawn shop and see if they'll give you 30 pieces of silver for it. Because it's our duty to spread God's love. It is our duty. He gave us the love to accomplish this. And so tomorrow and this week later, you'll get to meet Kenny. And everything about that man is to love. Well, with one exception. My ex, he found out she was sleeping in her car at her job just a couple blocks away from him, and he got all freaked out and said, she can stay here, call her immediately. And she moved in with him, and a month and a half, 2 months later, he called me and said, Greg, I can't take it. And he thought it was going to hurt our relationship. That's what kind of heart he's got. He was afraid it was going to harm us, and I laughed, and I said, no. Buddy, it's okay. It's all right. But everybody's dying around this man. And God willing, he's alive tomorrow when I get there, and you get to meet Kenny. This is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is meeting Kenny. The bad is having to move away from him. And the ugly is the death. The deaths that are still coming. I'll be there for him, though. With open arms, open heart, and all the love that I can give this man. All the love I can give him. He's a Christian, too. And nobody would have known that unless they said hello. Stay tuned.